Ever cut someone off and never looked back? Right, I did, if so.
I did not plan to start a family war at my sister's graduation. I really didn't. But when my mother grabbed the microphone uninvited, because of course she did, and announced in that cheery way she reserves for fundraisers and church raffles that one of her children had actually brought her joy, the room laughed and clapped, and I smiled the way you smile when a dentist says you will feel only a little pressure. And then my husband leaned toward me and asked, very softly, whether I wanted to keep pretending or whether I was ready to stop bleeding for people who never bothered to ask where the blood was coming from, and I realized I was done pretending. Mom did not say my sister's name because she did not need to, and she did not say mine because she never does unless she needs a cautionary tale. And while the families at the next table clapped and the dean looked confused about why this sudden speech had interrupted the program, I saw Sarah soaking it in with the half-apology smile she uses when she wants credit for being humble, and I felt that old, sour mix of shame and fury and a little grief for the version of me that kept hoping the next milestone might unlock a basic level of respect, like those customer loyalty cards where if you suffer through enough slights you finally earn a free coffee, except my card always reset to 0. Mark slid his hand over mine, steady and warm, and asked again, do we let it go or do we end it, because he had brought what we talked about. And I thought about all the times I swallowed it down because making noise in this family gets you labeled dramatic while quietly bleeding out gets you called strong, and I realized I was tired of being strong in the way that only benefits the people doing the damage. So I nodded once, barely, and he opened his briefcase with that small, decisive click. That sounds like a door closing on a long hallway. Here is where I admit something that will make some people angry, because it will sound like I chose the wrong day on purpose. But the truth is that my mother chose the stage, not me. She could have said her little line at brunch. She could have whispered it in a corner. She could have let my sister have her moment without stepping on everyone else to climb higher. And if she wanted this to be a strictly private family matter, then maybe she should not have turned it into a performance with an audience and a microphone, and maybe I am allowed to answer on the same stage where I was just slapped. Mark stood up in that calm way of his, no theatrics, and said that my mother's sentence was odd since these statements say otherwise, and I swear the room did not just quiet, it recalibrated. Because the word statements carries weight in a country where we file taxes and sign mortgages and spend our lives proving who we are with paperwork, and the dean paused with his program halfway to the podium. And a few parents whispered the way people whisper at airports when a gate agent suddenly looks worried, and Sarah glanced at me like I had betrayed some silent sister pact, even though all I had done for years was absorb the blow so she could keep sailing along without looking back. I should tell you how we got here, but for now it matters that Mark did not raise his voice, and he did not attack anybody's character. He simply placed a neat stack of documents on the table like a teacher returning graded work, each page flagged, each account highlighted, and when my mother laughed that thin laugh she uses when she thinks she can charm her way out, he did not argue. He just slid the first page forward far enough for the people nearest us to see, and my aunt stopped chewing. And my cousin lowered his phone in that slow motion that means he just realized he might be filming the wrong side of history. The thing about family is that we all live inside a version of the story we were handed as kids, and mine was that I was difficult while Sarah was easy, that I was expensive while Sarah was an investment, that I was the reason for headaches while Sarah was the reason for champagne, and when you live inside a story long enough you start paying the bills for it even when you have no idea what the charges are for, which is how, years ago, I swallowed the line that there was no money for my degree. And later no spare cash when I needed a medical procedure, yet somehow there were resources for my sister's extras, and I am not saying any of this to make you pity me. I am saying it so you understand why nodding to Mark felt less like revenge and more like finally standing up from a chair that had been pressing into my ribs for half my life. My mother reached for the stack, and Mark, who knows rules the way some men know sports stats, said he would be happy to hand anything to any family member who wanted to read, and that he had additional copies for anyone who preferred to take a set home, and that these were sourced and dated and not opinion, and for the first time in a very long time my voice came out without shaking as I said, into the same space my mother had used for her little speech, that if you are going to award joy like A trophy, then you should also account for the cost of it, because the ledger does not only run in one direction, and some of us have been footing the bill while being told we do not count. I know people will say I ruined a graduation, and maybe I did, but I did not start the fire. I just stopped pretending I could hold the smoke in my lungs without choking. And if there is one thing I hope my sister learns from this, it is that adults do not get to keep the shine without carrying a little weight, and that what feels like loyalty when it protects you at someone else's expense is not love, it is theft with better branding. Mark turned the top page toward my mother with the corner of his finger, gentle and precise, and I did something small, but decisive that felt like claiming my life back. I asked the event coordinator to leave the microphone where it was. And when my mother tried to take it, I held it steady and said we were almost finished, which was true in a way that none of them understood yet, because the first page alone was enough to scramble the narrative they had been selling for years, and as the printed lines came into view and the dates lined up in a way that even a friendly crowd could not ignore, my mother's smile faltered. Her hand slipped off the mic, and Mark laid the papers on the table one by one while I watched her face drain of color and finally, let the silence do what my words never could. When Mark placed the first page so that the families closest to us could actually read the header and the memo lines rather than just guess, I felt the old urge to step back and apologize for making trouble rise up like a reflex I learned in childhood. And I swallowed it because the truth is not trouble. The truth is a bill that eventually comes due, and if my mother wants to talk about joy like it is a trophy, then we are allowed to talk about cost like it is a receipt that has names on it and signatures that match, which is why I let him speak while I kept my hands wrapped around the base of the microphone so my mother could not yank it away again and declare the conversation over simply because she was losing it. He said, in that measured tone he uses when he is explaining a mortgage to a panicked client, that many years ago there had been a custodial account opened in my name, the kind of account parents set up when a kid is too young to sign for herself. And that when I reached the age where it should have been transferred, it never was, and that over the following years the account was quietly emptied through routine withdrawals that, taken one by one, looked boring and harmless, but, viewed together, spelled out a tidy cover story for something that did not need a cover story if it were truly innocent, and at that point my aunt leaned in far enough to read the pages, and my cousin whispered the word tuition like it tasted wrong in his mouth. I need you to understand how we even had those pages, because we did not hack anything or steal anything or pull some dramatic movie stunt months ago. When we were reviewing our own finances and I mentioned the college money that my grandfather used to joke about in card games before he died, Mark asked whether I had ever seen actual statements rather than just hearing stories at family dinners. And when I admitted that I had only ever been told the account had been small and had been used for my braces and a few school expenses, he suggested we request the records because, as an adult, I have every right to see them, and when the envelope arrived from the bank with the printouts and the line items and the names, we sat on our couch with highlighters like two very boring detectives and watched a pattern assemble itself in front of us that made my stomach drop. The pattern was not complicated, which is what made it infuriating. There were withdrawals timed exactly to my sister's enrollment deadlines, housing deposits, a so-called leadership program fee that was pitched to the family as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and that summer abroad my mother loves to mention as proof of my sister's initiative, with travel insurance and program installments, with my mother's signature right next to the line that still listed me as the beneficiary of the account. And if you think I am exaggerating, then please picture the caption my mother put on social media that summer about investing in experiences, and then place it next to the bank's line that says transfer completed with the date that matched. And tell me again how this is a misunderstanding instead of a choice. My mother tried the move where she calls something a private matter, which is the family code for stop embarrassing me, and Mark, who knows when to be gentle and when to be firm, said that he would happily keep every number private and every dollar amount redacted because the exact figures were not the point, the consent and the fairness were the point, and that he had blacked out totals on every copy because this was not about shaming anyone for what they spent, it was about acknowledging whose name was on the account when it was emptied, which is when the couple at the next table, strangers to us, looked at my mother with the kind of polite discomfort people reserve for rude behavior in public. And the dean stepped back fully because even he understood this was not a microphone glitch, it was a reckoning. Sarah did what she always does when my mother's decisions spill hot oil on the floor. She looked stricken. She reached for my arm like she wanted to be the bridge, and she said she never asked for any of this, that she did not even know there was an account in my name, that she thought Mom had scholarships and savings, and that everything had been arranged above her head. And I will be honest with you, because I promised to be honest. A part of me wanted to give her that lifeline and let her swing to safety because protecting her has been my unpaid side job since childhood, but another part of me remembered filing FAFSA loan and taking campus jobs and swallowing the humiliation of calling the bursar while my mother told me to be resilient. And I could not keep shielding someone who never once turned around to ask what wind was pushing her forward. I did not raise my voice, I did not cry, I did not deliver a speech rehearsed in the shower. I pointed to the highlighted note where the bank requires the custodian to act in the best interest of the minor. I said that using a child's fund to bankroll another child's extras is not best interest, that it is favoritism with a paper trail. And I said that if my mother wanted to be celebrated for joy, then she should also stand here and accept responsibility for how that joy was purchased at my expense year after year, and when I finished, I handed the microphone back to the stand because I did not want to hold anything that might make this feel like theater. The revenge, if you insist on calling it that, was not the gasp or the whispers or the way my mother's smile collapsed. It was the moment a few tables over when one of her closest friends, a woman who has watched me disappear behind polite smiles for decades, folded the redacted copies into her purse like evidence, turned to my mother, and said in a voice that could slice marble that she was disappointed, and that one word did more damage to my mother's image than any dramatic accusation I could ever launch, because it told the room that the queen had no clothes, not because I said so, but because a peer did. My mother started with the line about bad memory and mix-ups and old paperwork being messy, the kind of vague fog people throw when the facts are too clear, and before she could float away on that cloud, Mark slid a second envelope across the table. This one thicker, with tabs that made my mother's eyes flicker in a way I have only seen when she realizes she might actually lose, and he asked, with all the courtesy of a man offering dessert menus, whether she would prefer that we stop here or whether we should turn to the next section, and the room went quiet again as if it was holding its breath, because nobody knew what was in that envelope, but I did, and I nodded. When Mark loosened the flap on the second envelope and angled it toward the light so the headers and dates were clear without being theatrical, I felt the room tilt in that quiet way a room tilts when a story people love begins to lose its footing. And as much as I wanted to spare everyone the discomfort, especially the families who were just here to clap and take pictures, I also knew that I had spent too many years cushioning a truth that had only ever bruised me back, so I steadied the microphone with one hand while he laid out the packet that started with insurance explanations of benefits, surgeon letters, and the sequence of emails where I had asked for help with a procedure my doctor said should not wait. And right next to those were my mother's replies about tightening belts and being patient, and how sometimes life is about endurance, which would have landed differently if the same week did not show payments from the custodial account to my sister's study abroad program. And the leadership retreat that came with a glossy brochure and a hashtag. I had braced for denial, for some wobbly story about mix-ups or clerical errors or how banks mislabel things, but the printouts did the speaking for us. Because they showed the timestamp on my message where I said I would take a payment plan and bring my own meals to work and maybe sell my car if it came to that, and then they showed the timestamp on my mother's wire to the program that advertised expanding horizons. And I am not saying a trip is evil and a retreat is a scandal. I am saying that a parent who tells one daughter to clench her jaw through pain while buying the other a horizon does not get to stand behind a microphone and talk about joy like it fell out of the sky onto only one child for no reason at all. Sarah, who has always been quick to apologize for the wrong things and slow to notice the right ones, reached for my wrist with a look that said she wanted to fix it without getting any of it on her. And she said she had not known about the medical bills and that she never would have taken a penny if she had realized where it came from. And I told her that I believed she had not read the labels on anything because nobody ever asked her to. But that being innocent of logistics did not make her innocent of impact, and that if she wanted to be the adult she keeps saying she is, then this was the moment to turn around and face the wind that had been at her back for years, not to cry in my direction and hope the storm passes. My mother tried the line about privacy again, which is our family's fire extinguisher for any blaze she accidentally starts, and Mark, who has spent his professional life living between dignity and documentation, said we were not here to debate feelings. We were here to align statements, and that he would happily put away every figure and every redacted total if she would just look at the dates and acknowledge that when I asked for help with a necessary procedure, she said there was no spare money, and that within days she paid several invoices that had nothing to do with urgent needs and everything to do with polishing a narrative that made her look like the mother of a star. There was a ripple from the next table, not a gasp, more like that low murmur people make in courtrooms when a judge sustains an objection, and one of my mother's longtime friends, a woman who has spent decades helping other people's daughters navigate complicated lives, lifted the page with the denial email between two careful fingers and asked my mother, very gently, whether she had really sent those words. And when my mother started to say something about tone and context, the friend shook her head, not unkindly, and said that context was exactly what the bank lines provided, which is when I felt something inside me finally set, not hard, not bitter, just firm. I told the room, not loudly but clearly, that I had carried the shame of being the child who always needed too much, when the truth was that I needed what any daughter would have asked for without apology, and that I had carried it quietly because I was raised to believe that protecting the family story was the same as loving the family, and then I said that, for once, I was going to pick a story that protected me. And I turned to the dean and the event coordinator, and I said I would like to make a short announcement that had nothing to do with numbers and everything to do with balance, and before anyone could spin that into another accusation, I explained that Mark and I had opened a small scholarship that morning in my grandfather's name, seated with our own check, earmarked for students who got told to be resilient when what they needed was help, and that we would be leaving an envelope with the office before we left so the first application could be posted next week. I did not look at my mother because this was not about punishing her with a snub. It was about clearing a path for myself and, if we are being honest, for my sister too. Because nothing forces a family to stop worshipping a false narrative like a better one standing right next to it, and when the room broke into that careful, slightly stunned applause people offer when they realize someone has taken a hit and turned it into a handrail, I heard Sarah's fiancé say softly that this was the woman he respected, which would have made me smile on a different day, but today it just made me tired and steady and ready to be done. My mother hissed that I was hijacking Sarah's celebration, and I told her that she had done that the second she made a speech about joy that erased me, and that all I had done was put the erased lines back on the page. And since she was so proud of public declarations, she could consider this one mine, and then I stepped back from the microphone because I did not want to make a meal of it. I wanted to make a point, and the point was made. Mark, who had stayed a step behind me the whole time the way good anchors do, picked up the second envelope, tapped the remaining tabbed section with his finger, and asked my mother if she would like to address the documents regarding property and custodial authority now or after dessert, and the way the blood left her face told everyone there that dessert could wait. When Mark pulled the final tab and eased out the documents that looked less dramatic than they sounded, because property paperwork never looks like a bomb until you read the lines that decide who gets to keep a key and who becomes a guest in a place she grew up calling home. I watched my mother lean forward with that particular alertness she saves for moments when she thinks she can outrun a consequence, and I felt the old fear rise up, that reflex where I smooth the edges so the people who cut me do not nick their fingers. And I let it pass because this was not a sting operation or a scene. It was a clear statement about ownership and consent, and it started with a plain explanation from Mark that was as careful as it was blunt, which is that a few months back, during one of those responsible adult weekends when we were reviewing wills and beneficiaries and making sure our own house could not be shaken loose by paperwork, He ran a quick search on the county recorder's site for my mother's address and found a draft transfer prepared by a document service that, if recorded, would have moved the title from my mother alone into joint tenancy with right of survivorship in my sister's name. Which in simple English meant that when my mother eventually passed, the entire property would slide to Sarah without probate and without any requirement to honor what our grandfather had always said at the table about fairness, and without any room for me except as a visitor who brings a pie. My mother jumped to the defense you could see coming from the parking lot, the one about how parents are allowed to plan and how she had every right to make her affairs easy, which is true in the same way it is true that you can put someone's name on a cake and call it a gift. But that does not make it a fair split when there are 2 daughters and 1 house, and Mark, patient to the point of saintliness when the facts are on his side, said that nobody was debating her right to plan, we were questioning the way she attempted to execute that plan, because what the document service had asked for and what my mother had supplied, according to the intake notes that were helpfully printed at the bottom of the form, included a so-called letter of authority that was not valid for this purpose and a claim of sole discretion over property the family had long discussed as an eventual equal inheritance, and, before anyone could pretend this was a misunderstanding, he placed down the timeline we had built across a page, with the dates my grandfather's lawyer had circulated a memorandum reminding everyone of his wishes, the dates my mother met with a new notary at a shipping store, and the date the draft transfer was generated with my sister listed as the sole second owner. I could feel the room tightening again, not in cruelty, more in that way a group of adults gets quiet when someone's hand is caught in the cookie jar after a long speech about calories. And my mother started to say she had never recorded anything and that nothing had actually happened, which is like saying you never lit the match because the wind blew it out, and Mark nodded and said he was glad it had not been recorded. And then he explained why it had not been recorded, which is that after he found the draft, he spoke to a property attorney who filed a simple notice of interest that required any title change on that address to be paused until both daughters signed off, and that letter, notarized and on file, meant the clerk would have kicked back any transfer that attempted to slide past my consent, and if you think that sounds like overkill, then you have never been the child whose seat is quietly removed from the table while she is in the kitchen washing the dishes. Sarah tried to climb back onto the innocence raft she had been rowing all afternoon, saying she had no idea about any of this and that Mom must have been trying to save everyone a headache. And, because I am done hugging lies to keep them warm, I asked Mark to show the last page, which was a printout of an email my mother had forwarded to her a few weeks after the draft was prepared, where the document service answered a question about whether adding a second name now would keep the process smoother later, and Sarah's reply, short and enthusiastic, said that she loved the plan and that if it helped avoid probate then she was all for it, and you could feel the floor tilt as her fiancé, who had spent the last hour looking like a man grinding his teeth behind his smile, finally turned toward her and asked whether there was any part of this she had intended to share with him before they started looking at houses and talking about joint finances, because the last time he checked he was signing up for a marriage, not a merger built on a surprise asset transfer from her mother. My mother snapped that I was poisoning the well and ruining a milestone, and I told her that she had planted the poison years ago when she started treating resources as a spotlight for one child and a lecture for the other, and that today was simply the first day the lights were bright enough for everybody to see the labels on the bottles, and the revenge here was not the humiliation or the gasps. It was a very calm piece of paper on the bottom of our stack that Mark slid across to the dean. Just so there would be no confusion about liability for the venue, a copy of the title notice with my signature and the attorney's stamp, which said in black and white that no transfer could be pushed through without my written consent, meaning the sneaky path had been shut months ago, and any future changes would have to happen in daylight with all names on the line. I do not know whether you could hear the sound of a future cracking, but I watched it happen in the way Sarah reached for her fiancé and missed because he was already 2 steps away, and in the way he took off the ring and placed it on the table, not with drama but with that quiet finality people use when they have decided they would rather be single than complicit. And as it sat there between the scholarship envelope and the redacted bank copies, The room learned what my family never wanted to admit, which is that truth does not need a stage to make noise. It just needs one person to stop whispering. In the minutes that followed the ring being placed on the table, not flung, not thrown, not accompanied by some theatrical line about betrayal or disappointment, but simply set down with the care of someone returning a borrowed item they no longer feel entitled to, the atmosphere in the room took on that strange, dense quiet that doesn't just mean people have stopped speaking, but that they're thinking things they cannot say out loud without admitting too much, and for the first time in years, maybe ever, I did not feel like the one disrupting the peace, but like the only person who had ever bothered to name what the peace was costing everyone else, and I stood there with my hands resting against the table, not trembling, not fuming, just finally still. Sarah didn't chase after him, not immediately, not in the way a person might if they felt wrongly accused or blindsided or heartbroken in that raw, human way that can't help itself, and instead she just sat there. Fingers pressed to her lips as if that might hold everything in, eyes darting toward our mother, and then away again, the silence between them heavier than any speech could have been. Because for all the years our mother had spoken over people and around people and through people, she had never really spoken to us when it mattered, and now that someone had spoken back with facts instead of feelings, she had nothing left in her voice except deflection and panic. I didn't gloat, because there was nothing in this moment that felt like a win in the traditional sense. No scoreboard, no audience rising to their feet, no final punch that landed clean. But there was something deeply satisfying about watching the machinery finally stop spinning, about hearing the gears grind to a halt after years of noise and friction and fake smiles. And in that stillness, I realized that all the therapy sessions and journaling prompts and failed attempts to win back her approval had really just been me asking a broken compass to tell me which way was north. The dean gently approached, awkward but composed, and asked if the microphone could be returned so the ceremony might conclude with the remaining names being called, and I nodded and stepped aside. Not because I was done, but because I had said what I came to say, and the rest of the room deserved to go home with their own stories intact. And as I sat down next to Mark, who had already closed his briefcase, leaned back in his chair, and started scanning the room the way he does after closing a particularly stubborn case file, I realized that this was probably the first time in over a decade that I didn't feel like I owed my mother a softer ending. What followed was a blur of names, muffled clapping, and a few brave attempts at small talk that sounded painfully hollow, like people were trying to stitch the fabric of the afternoon back together without acknowledging the tear, and I watched as cousins avoided eye contact, as old friends made polite excuses to leave early, and as the version of my mother that she had spent years curating, the proud, selfless matriarch who raised 2 daughters with love and sacrifice, flickered like a bad projection when the real jammed and no one could pretend the scratches weren't there. Sarah eventually stood, walked over, and asked in a voice so quiet I almost didn't recognize it whether I had meant to destroy her day, and I told her the truth, that I had meant to stop letting someone else narrate mine, that I had stayed silent through too many of her special days, where my job was to smile and pose and clap while biting my tongue, and that if her joy had required my erasure, then maybe it was never joy to begin with, but just a more socially acceptable form of theft. She didn't argue. She didn't apologize either. She just nodded once, as if marking something privately, and then walked out of the venue alone, no photos, no champagne, no smiling family waiting at the exit, just one long pause between who she thought she was and who she had just been revealed to be. And, while part of me wanted to follow her, to soften the blow, to rescue her from the aftermath, I knew that doing so would only drag me back into the role I had finally crawled out of, the quiet one, the forgiving one, the daughter who cleaned up after messes she didn't make. My mother didn't speak to me that day, not after the ceremony, not at the dinner she had reserved at a restaurant none of us ended up attending. Not when we crossed paths in the parking lot, and she looked at me like I was a stranger who had just stepped out of her own house holding keys she forgot she gave me. And while the younger version of me would have chased that look down with explanations and reassurances and some desperate attempt to restore harmony, the version of me who had finally spoken into a microphone and watched the truth ripple through a room, understood that some silences are not voids, they are boundaries, and this one had been earned. In the days that followed, there were calls from extended relatives, some asking for copies of documents, some pretending they hadn't heard what was said, others offering half-hearted, I had no idea apologies that meant well but landed flat. And I didn't chase any of it because the point had never been to win people over or burn bridges or claim some dramatic victory. The point had been to reclaim a version of myself that wasn't built on constant justification, to finally say, here is what happened, here is what you did, and here is why I am done pretending it didn't matter. Mark and I drove home in silence. Not the tense kind, but the kind you share with someone who has just watched you walk through fire and didn't try to pull you back, didn't hand you a bucket, just stood there holding your coat for when it was done. And as we passed the city limits and the graduation banners faded into the rearview, he reached over, rested his hand on mine, and said nothing, because there was nothing left to say, only the quiet weight of knowing that for the first time in a long time, the story belonged to me, and I had told it out loud. I don't know if my mother will ever speak to me again, and I don't know if Sarah will recover from what she lost or understand what she almost cost me, but I do know this. The silence that followed wasn't emptiness, it was space, space I had carved with truth, protected with evidence, and filled with a version of myself that didn't need applause or forgiveness, just freedom.